The sun hung low over the vast, golden plains, casting long shadows across the rolling hills where cattle grazed lazily in the fading light. It was a quiet evening, the kind that made a man feel the weight of his own solitude. Ethan Miller, a rugged rancher with calloused hands and a sun-weathered face, leaned against the wooden fence of his property, staring out at the land he had worked so hard to maintain. The air smelled of earth and hay, and the distant sound of crickets had already begun their nightly song. He was a man of few words, hardened by years of labor. But even the strongest men feel the ache of loneliness when the days grow long and the nights longer. Ethan had built this ranch from nothing, felled the trees, raised the barn, dug the wells, all with his own 2 hands. He took pride in his work, in the sturdy home he had made, but pride couldn't fill the empty chair at his table or the silence in the rooms when the fire burned low. His friends in town, well-meaning but sometimes careless with their words, often teased him about his unmarried state. "A man ought to have a wife," they'd say, slapping him on the back with a laugh. "What good's a fine house if there's no one to share it with?" At first, Ethan brushed it off, but the jokes wore on him like a stubborn burr stuck in his boot. One evening, after one too many drinks at the saloon, his friends' laughter ringing in his ears, Ethan did something foolish. A mail-order bride catalog had been left on the counter, filled with letters from women seeking husbands out west. Most men who sent for brides did so with hope, with earnest hearts, but not Ethan. In a moment of bitterness, he scribbled a letter, half joking, half defiant. He didn't care who answered. He didn't even expect a reply. He just wanted to prove he could do it, that he wasn't some lonely old rancher to be pitied. He described himself plainly, strong, hard-working, with land to his name, and sent it off without another thought. Weeks passed, and Ethan nearly forgot about the letter. The seasons didn't wait for a man's pride. There was always work to be done. Fences needed mending, cattle needed tending, and the land demanded constant attention. But then, one ordinary morning, a stagecoach rolled into town, kicking up dust as it came to a stop. And there, stepping down with a worn carpetbag in hand, was a woman. She was larger than most, her frame sturdy, her cheeks round and flushed from travel. Her dress was simple, neatly mended, but far from fancy. She looked around with quiet eyes, not nervous, but steady, like someone who had seen hardship and met it without flinching. The townsfolk whispered, some hiding smirks behind their hands. After all, Ethan Miller had sent for a bride as a joke, and now here she was. Ethan, standing at the edge of the crowd, felt a twist in his gut. He hadn't really thought this through. What was he supposed to do now? The woman, Rose, as she would later introduce herself, didn't seem to notice the whispers. She adjusted her shawl, took a deep breath, and walked toward him with a small, hopeful smile. And just like that, the joke didn't seem so funny anymore. The town square had never felt so crowded to Ethan as it did in that moment, with every pair of eyes fixed upon him and the woman who had just stepped off the stagecoach. The dust from the road still hung in the air, catching the late afternoon sun in lazy golden swirls, and the murmurs of the gathered townsfolk buzzed like flies around a honeypot. He could feel their curiosity, their amusement, some even whispering behind their hands, stifling laughter at the sight of the bride he had ordered in jest, now standing before him in the flesh. Rose was not what anyone would call delicate. Her frame was broad, her hands strong and work-worn, her face open and unassuming beneath the brim of a plain bonnet. She carried herself with a quiet dignity, as though she had long grown accustomed to the weight of others' judgment and had decided it was no burden worth bearing. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. He had expected. Well, he wasn't sure what he had expected. Perhaps he had thought no one would answer his careless letter at all, or that if someone did, she would take one look at his rough life and turn right back around. But Rose stood there, patient as the earth itself, waiting for him to speak first. The silence stretched between them, thick and awkward, until at last she tilted her head slightly and said, in a voice softer than he anticipated, "You must be Ethan." It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even a question. Just a simple statement, as if she had already decided to meet this moment with grace, no matter what foolishness had brought her here. Ethan cleared his throat and nodded, suddenly aware of how ridiculous he must look, standing there like a startled deer. "Yeah," he managed. "That's me." He shifted his weight from one boot to the other, then gestured vaguely toward his wagon hitched nearby. "I brought the wagon. For your things." Rose glanced down at her single carpet bag, then back up at him, and for the first time, the barest hint of amusement flickered in her eyes. "This is all I have," she said simply. Something about that struck Ethan deeper than he cared to admit. No trunks, no finery, no pretense, just one bag holding everything she owned. He had known women who would sooner die than travel without half a dozen dresses and every ribbon they owned. But Rose carried her life lightly, as though she had learned long ago that possessions were not the same as security. The townsfolk were still watching, still waiting for the spectacle they were sure would unfold. Maybe a fight, maybe tears, maybe Ethan calling the whole thing off right then and there. But instead, he reached out and took the bag from her. "Well," he muttered, "let's get going then." The ride back to the ranch was quiet. The only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the steady clop of the horses' hooves against the dirt road. Ethan kept his eyes fixed ahead, his grip tight on the reins, painfully aware of the woman sitting beside him. He had imagined this moment many times in the days since sending the letter, sometimes with dread, sometimes with bitter humor. But now that it was here, he didn't know what to do with it. Should he apologize? Should he explain that this had all been a mistake? But the words stuck in his throat, stubborn as a rusted lock. Rose, for her part, seemed content with the silence. She watched the landscape roll by, the endless stretch of grassland, the distant rise of the mountains, the cattle dotting the hills like slow-moving shadows. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, measured. "It's beautiful land." Ethan blinked. He had lived here for years, had sweated and bled for every inch of this ranch, but he couldn't remember the last time he had stopped to think of it as beautiful. "It's work," he said gruffly. "Most good things are," she replied. He shot her a sideways glance, but her expression was unreadable, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. Who was this woman? What kind of person stepped into a stranger's life with such quiet certainty? The questions gnawed at him, but he didn't ask them. Instead, he focused on the road, on the familiar path home, now made strange by the presence of someone he had never expected to bring there. When they finally reached the ranch, the sun was beginning to dip below the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Ethan hopped down from the wagon and hesitated before offering Rose a hand. She took it without fuss, her grip firm and steady as she stepped onto the ground. For a moment, they stood there in the yard, the house looming before them, a solid, sturdy thing built to last but not built for warmth. Ethan suddenly saw it through her eyes. The bare porch, the unadorned windows, the absence of any touch that might suggest a woman's presence. He felt an odd pang of shame, though he couldn't have said why. "I ain't much for fancy things," he muttered, as if that explained everything. Rose nodded, then surprised him by walking straight to the nearest flower bed, overgrown and choked with weeds, and kneeling down. She ran her fingers over the tangled stems, then glanced back at him. "Soil's good," she said. "With a little care, this could bloom real nice." Ethan stared at her. Was she talking about the flowers? Or something else? Before he could ask, she stood, brushed the dirt from her skirts, and turned toward the house. "Shall we go in?" And just like that, Ethan realized with a sinking feeling that this was no longer a joke. This was real. She was here, and he had no idea what came next. The house had never felt so small. Ethan lingered in the doorway, watching as Rose stepped inside, her eyes sweeping slowly across the room. The rough-hewn table littered with unwashed dishes, the hearth layered with old ash, the shelves cluttered with tools and stray bits of harness leather. A man's domain, untouched by any hand but his own, and it showed. He hadn't thought much about it before now. A ranch was for working, not for prettying up. But standing there, seeing it through her eyes, he became acutely aware of the dust on the windowsills, the cobwebs in the corners, the way the floorboards creaked underfoot like the groaning bones of something long neglected. Rose didn't say a word. She set her carpet bag down by the door and rolled up her sleeves. Ethan frowned. "What are you?" She was already moving, gathering the dishes with brisk efficiency, stacking them in the wash basin. "You got fresh water?" she asked, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "Well, yeah, but..." "Good." She pumped water into the basin, the squeak of the handle cutting through the silence. A man can't eat proper off dirty plates. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it. He hadn't expected this. He'd thought she'd balk at the mess, maybe even turn up her nose at the roughness of it all. But Rose didn't hesitate. She scrubbed the dishes with the same steady determination she'd shown stepping off that stagecoach, her hands moving with practiced ease. Ethan stood there, useless as a fence post in a flood, until at last he muttered, "Ain't no need for you to do that." Rose didn't pause. "Somebody's got to." The words hung there between them, simple and undeniable. Somebody did have to. And for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, Ethan felt the weight of all the things he'd let slide. The meals half-eaten and forgotten, the mending left undone, the quiet decay of living alone. He'd told himself it didn't matter. But watching Rose work, he wondered if maybe it did. He retreated outside under the pretense of checking on the livestock, but really, he just needed air. The evening was cool, the sky deepening into twilight, and the familiar sounds of the ranch, the lowing of cattle, the rustle of wind through the grass, usually soothed him. Tonight, they didn't. His thoughts chased each other like dogs after their own tails. What was he doing? This wasn't what he'd planned. He'd thought, well, he hadn't thought at all, had he? Just acted on impulse, like a fool. When he finally mustered the courage to go back inside, the change stopped him in his tracks. The table was clean. The floor had been swept. A fire crackled in the hearth, its light flickering over walls that no longer looked quite so dingy. And there, on the stove, a pot simmered, filling the air with a rich, savory smell that made his stomach growl before he could stop it. Rose stood at the counter, kneading dough with the same quiet focus she'd given everything else. She didn't look up as he entered, but she said, "Supper's near ready." Ethan swallowed. "You didn't have to." "I know." She dusted flour from her hands. "But a man works hard. He ought to eat well." There was again that simple certainty, as if the world operated on rules he'd somehow never learned. Ethan didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything at all. The meal was the best he'd had in years. Afterward, Rose took the dishes away before he could protest, and Ethan found himself sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, listening to the sounds of her moving about the house. It was strange having someone else there. Stranger still how quickly he'd gotten used to it. Night fell proper, and the house settled into a silence that wasn't quite silence. Just a softer kind of noise, the kind made by two people sharing space without yet knowing how to fill it. Ethan banked the fire while Rose tidied the last of the kitchen. He should say something, he thought. But what? He was still trying to figure that out when he heard her voice, so quiet he almost missed it. "Lord, watch over this house, and soften his heart, so he might see the good you've put before him." A prayer. She was praying for him. Ethan froze, something twisting sharp in his chest. He wasn't a praying man himself, not really, but he knew enough to recognize a kindness when he heard one. And that was a kindness he didn't deserve. He turned away before she could see him, the weight of his own foolishness pressing down like a stone. Tomorrow, he told himself, tomorrow he'd figure this out. But for the first time, he wasn't sure he wanted to. The sky had been brooding since dawn, a sullen gray blanket stretched tight over the valley, and by midday, the first distant growl of thunder rolled across the hills like a warning. Ethan stood in the open barn door, squinting at the horizon where dark clouds churned like a stirred pot. The air smelled of damp earth and something sharper, ozone, the electric tang of an approaching storm. He'd known enough bad weather in his time to recognize the signs. This wouldn't be some gentle summer shower. This would be the kind of storm that tested fences, spooked livestock, and left a man soaked to the bone if he wasn't careful. Behind him, Rose straightened from where she'd been mending a torn saddlebag, her needle pausing mid-stitch as another rumble echoed overhead. "Going to be a rough one," she observed, her voice calm, but edged with the same understanding Ethan felt in his bones. Yep, he didn't waste words on what they both already knew. Instead, he moved briskly, checking the barn shutters, securing loose tools, making sure the animals were settled. The cattle would weather it fine. They'd bunched together under the trees by the creek, their thick hides shedding rain like oiled canvas. But the younger stock, the calves, and the two skittish colts he'd been breaking in, needed watching. Rose set aside her mending without being asked and followed him outside, her skirts hitched up just enough to keep clear of the mud already forming in the yard. She didn't wait for instructions. She just started helping, her movements efficient and sure as she checked the chicken coop's latch and tossed extra hay into the lean-to where the goats huddled. Ethan watched her out of the corner of his eye, struck again by how little she hesitated, how naturally she stepped into the rhythm of the work. Most women he'd known would have stayed inside, fretting over damp hems or the state of the floors. Not Rose. The first fat raindrops hit just as they finished, splattering the dust into dark, coin-sized splotches. By the time they made it back to the porch, the sky split open in earnest, rain sheeting down so thick it blurred the barn from view. Ethan shook water from his hat, his shirt already plastered to his shoulders, and Rose wrung out her sleeves with a quiet sigh. "Reckon that's it for outdoor work today," he muttered. Rose nodded toward the kitchen. "I'll put coffee on." It should have been comfortable, hunkering down inside while the storm raged beyond the walls, the fire crackling, the smell of brewing coffee filling the room. But something nagged at Ethan, a restless itch between his shoulder blades. He paced to the window, staring out at the downpour. "What is it?" Rose asked, handing him a steaming mug. "That new calf," he said. "The black and white one. Saw her wandering near the creek earlier." Rose's brow furrowed. "You think she's stuck?" "Might be." The creek swelled fast in heavy rain, its banks turning to slick mud that could trap a clumsy, young animal easy as a bear trap. Rose set her own cup down. "Best go check, then." Ethan blinked. "Ain't no need for you to." But she was already pulling on her shawl, her face set in that same stubborn calm. "You'll need an extra set of hands if she's mired." The rain hadn't let up. If anything, it fell harder now, the wind driving it sideways in stinging gusts. Ethan led the way, his boots sinking ankle-deep in mud as they slogged toward the creek. The calves panicked, bleating reached them before they saw her. A high, desperate sound, nearly drowned by the storm. There she was, mired up to her haunches in the slick creek bank, her legs churning uselessly as the rising water lapped at her belly. Every thrash only sank her deeper. Ethan cursed under his breath and waded in, the cold water shocking the air from his lungs. The mud sucked at his boots like greedy hands, and the calf, terrified, flailed, nearly braining him with a wild kick. Then Rose was there, right beside him, her skirts dragging heavy with water, her arms outstretched. "Easy," she murmured, not to Ethan, but to the calf. "Easy now, and damn if the little fool didn't still for half a heartbeat, long enough for Rose to loop a rope around her middle. Together, they hauled, muscles straining, boots slipping. The mud released its grip with a wet gasp, and the calf sprawled on a solid ground, her sides heaving. Rose was laughing breathlessly, her hair plastered to her face, her dress ruined, and Ethan. Ethan realized, with a jolt like lightning to the ribs, that he'd been wrong about her. All wrong. This wasn't just some woman he dragged here as a joke. This was someone who'd wade into a storm to save a dumb animal without a second thought. The calf scrambled up and bolted for the safety of the herd, leaving Ethan and Rose standing there in the downpour, soaked through and filthy. Rose wiped mud from her cheek and met his gaze. "Coffee's still hot," she said, as if this were any ordinary day. And Ethan, for the life of him, couldn't think of a single thing to say. So he just nodded and followed her home. The days that followed the storm carried a quiet shift in the air, subtle as the first frost creeping over autumn grass. Nothing you could point to directly, but something you felt in your bones all the same. Ethan found himself watching Rose more, not with the wary skepticism of before, but with a slow dawning curiosity that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. It wasn't just the way she'd waded into the creek without hesitation, though that played its part. It was the smaller things, the ones that slipped under a man's guard before he noticed. The way she hummed under her breath while kneading bread dough, the precise fold of her hands when she paused to pray before meals, the fact that she'd somehow memorized how he took his coffee, black, 2 sugars, after only 3 mornings. He caught himself once, leaning against the doorframe of the kitchen, staring as she peeled potatoes with quick, efficient strokes of the knife. She moved through the world with a quiet competence that made his own rough ways feel clumsy in comparison. The realization sat sour in his gut. He'd brought her here as a joke, a spiteful reaction to the ribbing of his friends, and yet here she was, tending his home with more care than he'd ever given it. The guilt of it gnawed at him. One evening, after a long day repairing the storm-damaged fence line, Ethan lingered at the wash basin longer than necessary, scrubbing dirt from his hand with more force than the task required. Rose was at the stove, stirring a pot of stew that sent rich, meaty steam curling toward the ceiling. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, exactly, but it itched at him, full of things unsaid. "You didn't have to do all this," he said at last, his voice rougher than he intended. Rose didn't turn. "Do what? Any of it?" He gestured vaguely, at the clean floorboards, the mended curtains, the supper bubbling on the stove. "I ain't exactly been welcoming." That made her pause. She set the spoon aside and turned to face him, her expression unreadable in the firelight. "No," she agreed softly. "You haven't." The honesty of it stung. Ethan braced for anger, for reproach, but Rose just studied him for a long moment before adding, "But that doesn't mean kindness isn't worth giving." Something in his chest tightened. He'd expected a fight, maybe even tears. Not this. This quiet grace that left him nowhere to hide. "Rose," he started, then stopped, the words tangling in his throat. "How did you apologize for something like this? For treating a person like a punchline?" She waited, patient as always, until he finally ground out, "I didn't bring you here for the right reasons." "I know." The simplicity of her answer knocked the breath from him. "You what?" "I knew the moment I stepped off that stage." Rose wiped her hands on her apron, her gaze steady. "The way you looked at me, the way the town whispered. It wasn't hard to guess." Ethan's face burned. "Then why stay?" For the first time, something like sorrow flickered across her face. "Because sometimes folks act cruel not 'cause they're mean at heart, but 'cause they're lonely. And lonely people do foolish things." She turned back to the stew, her voice barely above a whisper. "I reckoned you might need someone to see past that." The words hit him like a kick from a mule. He'd been so busy assuming she was naive, so certain she was some desperate woman clinging to the first offer she'd gotten, that it had never occurred to him she might have chosen this. Chosen him despite everything. The realization left him raw. Later, after supper was eaten and the dishes dried, Ethan found Rose on the porch, her shawl pulled tight against the evening chill. He hesitated, then sat beside her, the old wood creaking under his weight. The sky was clear for once, the stars sharp as pinpricks in a vast, dark blanket overhead. "I ain't good with words," he said at last. "But I'm sorry." Rose didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was soft. "I forgive you." 3 words, so simple, and yet they unknotted something in him he hadn't realized was tied so tight. They sat there in silence after that, side by side beneath the stars, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Ethan didn't feel alone. The morning dawned clear and golden, the kind of day that made a man feel like the world had been scrubbed fresh overnight. Ethan stood at the fence line, watching the cattle graze in the dew-drenched grass, but his mind wasn't on the herd. It hadn't been for days. Not since the storm. Not since the creek. Not since Rose had looked at him with those quiet, knowing eyes and told him she forgave him. Forgiveness was a strange thing. It didn't erase what he'd done. Nothing could. But it settled over the ranch like a softening rain, easing the brittle tension that had hummed between them since her arrival. Now, when Rose handed him his coffee in the mornings, her fingers brushed his just a second longer than necessary. When she passed him a plate at supper, her smile was warmer, less guarded. Small things, but to Ethan, who'd spent years measuring his life in solitude. They felt as vast as the prairie sky. He'd started noticing other things, too. The way the sunlight caught the reddish strands in her hair when she worked in the garden. The faint hum of hymns under her breath as she kneaded bread dough. The way she'd taken to leaving his favorite biscuits wrapped in a cloth by the stove when he left for dawn chores, still warm from the oven. It wasn't just kindness anymore. It was care. And that realization lodged in his chest like a stone. Because Ethan Miller wasn't a man who'd ever expected to be cared for. Not like this. His parents had been hard people, their love measured in labor and survival, not soft words or gentle touches. He'd grown up thinking that was the way of things, that a man worked, and if he was lucky, he endured. But Rose moved through the world as if kindness were as natural as breathing, as if tenderness weren't a weakness, but a strength. It terrified him, not because he didn't want it, but because he did. The thought struck him one evening as he watched her mend one of his shirts by lamplight, her needle flashing in and out of the fabric with practiced ease. This woman, this strong, steady, impossible woman, had seen the worst of him and stayed anyway, had waded into mud and storm for a dumb animal because it was the right thing to do, had forgiven him when he didn't deserve it. And suddenly, the idea of letting her go, of pretending this had all been some temporary arrangement, felt like the worst kind of lie. He waited until the next Sunday, when the morning sun slanted through the kitchen window in buttery shafts, gilding the edges of the flour, dusting Rose's arms as she rolled out pie crust. Ethan stood in the doorway, his hat clenched in his hands, and cleared his throat. Rose glanced up, her cheeks pink from the oven's heat. "You're back early from the north pasture." "Yeah." His mouth was dry. "Figure we ought to talk." Something in his tone must have tipped her off, because she stilled, wiping her hands on her apron. "All right." Ethan took a deep breath. "I ain't good at this, but I've been thinking. A lot." He gestured between them. "About this." Rose didn't move. "What about it?" "It ain't right." The words came out rougher than he meant. "The way it started, I mean. Me bringing you here as some joke." He swallowed hard. "You deserve better than that." Rose studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "And what do you think I deserve?" The question hung between them, heavy as a harvest moon. Ethan stepped forward, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her green eyes, close enough to catch the faint scent of cinnamon and yeast that always clung to her. "A real marriage," he said hoarsely, "if you'll have me. Not because you got no other choice, but because you want to." His throat worked. "Because I sure as hell want you to." For one heart-stopping second, Rose didn't react. Then, slowly, a smile bloomed across her face. Not the polite, guarded one he'd grown used to, but something radiant and real. "Took you long enough to ask," she murmured. And just like that, the stone in Ethan's chest dissolved. They were married properly the following week in the little white church at the edge of town, with the pastor's wife playing the wheezy harmonium and a handful of neighbors as witnesses. Rose wore a dress the color of spring wheat, and when she slid a simple gold band onto Ethan's finger, her hands were steady. No one mentioned how it had started. No one dared. Because the way it was ending, with Ethan kissing his bride as the congregation cheered, with Rose's laughter ringing against the rafters, that was the only story that mattered now. The seasons turned, as seasons do, with the relentless certainty of sunrise. Summer's scorch mellowed into autumn's gold, and the ranch, once a place of solitary toil, thrummed with a new rhythm. It wasn't just the physical changes, though those were plain enough. The garden Rose tended now sprawled twice its original size, heavy with tomatoes and beans and fat orange pumpkins. The porch boasted 2 rocking chairs instead of 1. The windows stayed open to the breeze, curtains fluttering like welcoming flags. No, the real difference was quieter, deeper, something felt in the marrow more than seen with the eye. Ethan had known hard work all his life, but he'd never known work could feel like this, like purpose, like partnership. Mornings began with Rose's biscuits and ended with her laughter ringing across the supper table. She'd taken to rising before dawn to pack lunches for the hired hands, and the men, gruff cowpokes who'd once eyed her with skepticism, now tipped their hats with genuine respect. Miss Rose's apple pie, they'd say, smacking their lips, could mend a broken heart and raise the dead besides. The townsfolk noticed the change in Ethan, too. Where once he'd been all sharp edges and scowls, now he paused to chat at the mercantile, even laughed once or twice. A rusty sound at first, but genuine. The women whispered behind their hands about how marriage had softened him, but the truth was simpler. Rose hadn't softened him. She'd reminded him he was human. And then there were the Sundays. Rose had started setting an extra plate at their table every Sabbath, not for any expected guest, but for whoever might need it. A tired mother from church with squalling toddlers. The old widower who lived up the canyon. Once, a band of dusty travelers passing through, their eyes hollow with hunger. "The Lord provides," Rose would say whenever Ethan raised an eyebrow at the extra mouths, "but he likes us to do the serving." Her generosity became something of a local legend. When the Johnson boy took sick with fever, it was Rose who appeared at their door with a pot of bone broth and a jar of honeyed thyme. When the harvest festival needed pies for the orphanage fundraiser, Rose rolled up her sleeves and baked 12. And when winter's first bite sent the Cooper family's chimney crashing through their rotten roof, it was Ethan, who showed up with a wagon load of timber and a team of hands to rebuild it. "Since when do you play carpenter?" Old man Cooper had wheezed, his breath fogging in the cold air. Ethan had shrugged, hefting a beam onto his shoulder. "Since my wife told me we've got lumber to spare." The real surprise wasn't that Rose gave so freely, but how it came back to them tenfold. The same hands they'd fed showed up to help when flash floods threatened the lower pastures. The children Rose had taught to bake left wildflower bouquets on their porch every spring. Even the soil seemed to reward her care. The ranch's yields doubled, then tripled, until Ethan's spreads became the envy of the county. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies dance over the barley field, Ethan turned to Rose with a wondering shake of his head. "You know, I used to think this land was all I needed." He caught her work-roughened hand in his. "Turns out I didn't know what enough looked like till you showed me." Rose squeezed his fingers, her wedding band warm between them. "Funny thing about blessings," she mused. "The more you share 'em, the bigger they grow." And as the first stars blinked awake overhead, Ethan realized he couldn't argue. Not when the proof surrounded him. In the rich earth, in the sturdy fences, in the woman beside him who'd turned a house into a home and a joke of a marriage into something real. The greatest miracle wasn't that she'd stayed. It was that she'd made him believe he deserved her. Years have a way of slipping past a man like water through cupped hands, too quick to hold, yet leaving behind the unmistakable proof of their passing. The mirror showed Ethan's streaks of silver now, threading through his once dark hair like frost on a window pane. The ranch, too, bore the marks of time. Fences rebuilt stronger than before. The barn expanded to hold more livestock. The once barren yard, now shaded by oak trees Rose had planted as saplings the spring after they married. But the truest measure of those years wasn't in the land or the lines on their faces. It was in the way the house echoed with children's laughter, 2 boys and a girl, each with Rose's steady gaze and Ethan's stubborn chin. It was in the way the townsfolk no longer remembered the awkward mail-order bride joke, only the family who'd become the backbone of the community. And it was in the way Ethan himself had changed, the rough edges of his solitude worn smooth by the constant, gentle press of love. One evening in late summer, when the fireflies hovered over the pasture like drifting sparks, Ethan found Rose on the porch swing, her hands busy shelling peas into a bowl. The children were chasing lightning bugs in the yard, their shouts ringing through the twilight. Without a word, Ethan settled beside her, the old wood creaking familiarly under his weight. Rose leaned into him, her shoulder warm against his, and for a long moment they simply watched, their children, their land, their life. "Remember when you thought marrying me was a joke?" Rose asked suddenly, her voice laced with quiet amusement. Ethan winced. "Don't remind me." He caught her hand, the one that still bore the simple gold band he'd placed there years ago. "Though I reckon it's the only smart thing I ever did, even if I was too dumb to know it at the time." Rose laughed, the sound as rich and warm as the summer air. "Funny how things work out." And wasn't that the truth? Ethan had started this journey with a spiteful chuckle and a sealed letter, never imagining it would lead here, to a full table, to a thriving ranch, to a woman whose quiet strength had rebuilt him piece by piece. He'd thought himself the one doing the choosing back then. Now he knew better. The screen door banged open as their youngest barreled onto the porch, her cupped hands glowing faintly. "Look, Mama, I caught one." Rose bent to admire the firefly trapped gently between the child's fingers, its light pulsing like a tiny heartbeat. "Beautiful," she murmured. "But best let it go, sweetheart. Some things aren't meant to be kept, just appreciated while they're near." The child opened her hands, and the insect spiraled upward, joining its kin in the darkening sky. Ethan watched it go, then turned to Rose with a smile that still felt new after all these years. "Some things," he corrected softly, "are worth holding on to." And as the stars blinked awake above them, as their children's laughter filled the night, Ethan knew he'd spend the rest of his life proving that truth. The end. If you enjoyed this story of love, redemption, and unexpected blessings, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs a reminder that true beauty is found in the heart. Your support helps us bring more heartfelt tales to life. Until next time, keep believing in second chances.